The door was already open when I arrived. Not open for me. Open because the caterers were still carrying in cases of wine, and no one had thought to close it. That was the first sign. I walked into my father's house carrying a bottle of Cabernet I'd picked out myself, and the first thing he said to me was, "You can put that with the rest of the bottles in the kitchen." Not hello. Not you made it, just kitchen. I said okay and went to the kitchen. My name is Claire. I'm 31 years old. I have a master's degree in aerospace engineering from MIT, a security clearance I'm not allowed to discuss at dinner parties, and a job title that takes about 45 seconds to explain to someone who doesn't work in my field. For the last 6 years, I've been a structural systems engineer at a defense contractor that builds the kind of aircraft that doesn't make the news until something goes wrong. And my job is to make sure nothing goes wrong. My father doesn't know any of this. Not because I never told him. I did. I told him when I got into MIT. I told him when I graduated. I told him when I got the job. Each time, he nodded the way you nod when someone tells you the weather, and you're already thinking about something else. My father is a man who measures worth in things he can see. Square footage, car brands, the zip code on a wedding invitation. A daughter who spends her days running stress fracture simulations on titanium alloy components doesn't register on that scale. My sister does. My sister Diane married a man named Robert who owns 3 car dealerships in the greater Phoenix area. She wears her hair the way women do in catalog photos, and she has opinions about countertop materials that she shares freely and at length. My father thinks she hung the moon. I've known this since I was 16. Tonight was my father's 65th birthday party. Diane had organized it. 200 guests, a catered dinner, a jazz quartet in the garden, the kind of event where the invitations were printed on cardstock thick enough to build furniture from. My father had built his real estate business into something that other people in his industry respected, and tonight was a celebration of that, of him. The way he told it, it was also a celebration of the family he'd built. I flew in from Seattle. I took a red-eye because the day flights were booked, and I'd had a long week. A longer month, honestly. There had been an issue with a component design on a classified project that I'd been working to resolve for 11 days straight, and I'd cleared it 2 days before the party. I was tired in the specific way that comes from caring intensely about something for a very long time, and then suddenly not having to anymore. I came anyway. Because he's my father, and 65 felt like the kind of number you show up for. When I put the wine in the kitchen, I ran into my sister. "You're wearing that?" she said. I looked down at my outfit. Dark slacks, a silk blouse, heels I'd bought specifically for this occasion. Yes, Mom's pearls would have been nice. Mom's pearls are in a safety deposit box in Seattle. Diane made a face that she'd been making at me since we were children. A slight compression of the lips, a fractional lift of one eyebrow, a look that communicated that I had, once again, gotten something wrong in a way that was too obvious to explain. Then she went back to directing the catering staff. The party filled in over the next hour. I knew some of the guests, neighbors from when we were growing up, a few of my father's old business partners, some people from his golf club. I smiled and made conversation. I answered questions about what I did with answers that were honest but abbreviated. Engineering. Defense sector. Seattle. That was usually enough to satisfy people who were really just asking to be polite. My father found me around 7:30. He was in a good mood, that particular kind of expansive good humor that comes when a man is surrounded by people who are happy to see him, and the bar has been open for 90 minutes. "Claire." He kissed my cheek. "Glad you came. Happy birthday. You look good." 65. "Can you believe it?" He looked around the room with evident satisfaction. "Diane did a wonderful job with all this." "She did. You should talk to Robert's friend Marcus. He's in tech. You two probably have things in common." I didn't say what I was thinking. I said, "I'll look for him." My father was already turning back toward a group of men near the fireplace. Then he stopped and turned halfway back, an afterthought. "Actually, could you check on the bar?" I think they might be running low on the sparkling water. You know how Diane gets when the setup isn't right. He wasn't asking me to fix something, he was asking me to check on something so he could ask a woman to fix something, and I was the woman standing closest to him. I understood this. I went to check on the sparkling water. It was fine. The bar was fine. The entire setup was fine. I stood near the French doors that opened onto the garden and watched the party for a few minutes. The jazz quartet was playing something I recognized but couldn't name. 200 people in good clothes, holding good drinks, celebrating a man I loved even when he frustrated me. I thought, I flew through the night to be here. I am here. That means something even if no one notices it. Then Diane appeared at my shoulder. Dad needs someone to go around with the appetizer trays for a bit. Maria twisted her ankle. I looked at her. Diane, I'm a guest. We're all family. It's just for 20 minutes while they find someone else. She was already pushing a tray into my hands. You're not exactly working the room anyway. I want to be precise about what happened in my body in that moment. There was a tightening across my chest, something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite hurt. It was the specific sensation of being seen and categorized in a way that has nothing to do with who you actually are. I had spent 6 years solving problems that, if they went unsolved, could end lives. I had done it well. I had done it in rooms full of men twice my age who had initially doubted me and eventually trusted me with things that mattered, and I was standing in my father's living room being handed a tray of bacon-wrapped dates. I took the tray. Because 20 minutes was 20 minutes, and making a scene was not something I was interested in doing. I moved through the room. I offered appetizers. A few people thanked me. One older man asked if there were any more of the mushroom ones. I said I'd check. It was when I was near the entrance hall, turning back toward the kitchen, that I heard my father's voice from around the corner, talking to someone I couldn't see. Both daughters, yes. Diane, you met her, she organized all of this, and Claire. A slight pause, just slight enough. She's in some kind of engineering. Defense, she says. Honestly, I'm not entirely sure what she does day to day. She's always been, I don't know. She lives in her head. The other voice said something I couldn't make out. I suppose, my father said. Though between us, I always thought she'd do something that amounted to more. You know, something you could point to. I stood there for 3 seconds. Then I went back to offering appetizers. Around 9 o'clock, the program began, people speaking, toasts being made, the particular ritual of a milestone birthday where everyone in the room takes turns telling the guest of honor how much he means to them. Diane spoke beautifully. Robert spoke warmly. 3 of my father's business partners spoke with the authority of men who have given many toasts and know how to land a joke. I was not on the program. I want to be honest. I didn't expect to be. Diane had organized this, and Diane and I have never moved in the same orbit when it came to our father's attention. I had learned a long time ago not to expect to be on the program. I stood near the back and listened and applauded at the right times. Then the toasts ended and the room shifted back into party mode, and I stepped outside to get some air. The garden was quieter. Just the edge of jazz coming through the glass and the sound of the fountain my father had installed 4 years ago that I had never quite understood aesthetically. I stood there in the dark and thought about my flight home in 2 days. I thought about my apartment and my project files and the particular silence of Seattle at 6 in the morning when I get up before everyone else and make coffee and watch the water. I had been outside for perhaps 7 minutes when I heard voices near the side entrance. The narrow path that connected the garden to the parking area. A group was coming in from outside, 4 men, 1 woman, all in formal attire, arriving late the way important people sometimes do because their schedules don't answer to party timelines. I recognized one of them, not personally, not at first, but the way you recognize a face you've seen in photographs, in briefing documents, in the specific context of your professional life. He was a man in his early 60s. Silver-haired, with the bearing of someone who has spent decades in rooms where decisions were made and had never found this remarkable. He was wearing a suit that fit the way suits fit when they are made for a specific body. His name was Gerald Harmon, and he was the CEO of Whitmore Aerospace, the largest civilian defense contractor in the country, and one of the 3 organizations whose structural standards my team was required to meet on every project we built. I had read 67 of his public statements on aerospace safety protocol. I had once spent an entire week implementing a design revision based on a framework his engineering board had published. He did not know I existed. I stepped back into the shadows near the fountain, not because I was hiding, but because I wasn't sure what to do with the information that Gerald Harmon was apparently a friend of my father's. This had never come up. In 6 years, this had never come up. They moved inside. I stayed in the garden for another few minutes. When I came back in, the party had found a second wind. Someone had turned the music up slightly. I got a glass of water from the bar and found a relatively quiet spot near the bookshelves. That was when I saw it. Near the center of the room, a small cluster of people who had been talking began to shift apart quickly in the way people do when something is wrong. A woman in a green dress was listing sideways, and the man next to her, her husband, I assumed, had his hands out but wasn't catching her, wasn't sure what was happening. She went down in stages, not all at once. Almost graceful, except for the way her glass fell and the way her breathing, when she hit the floor, was wrong in a specific, clinical way that I registered before I consciously processed it. I was moving before I knew I had decided to move. Give her space, I said, loud enough to carry. The people around her stepped back, not because they knew who I was, but because my voice had something in it that expected compliance. I knelt down. Her airway was clear. Her pulse was there but irregular, and she was not unconscious. Her eyes were open, tracking, but her color was wrong and she was moving her lips without sound. Has she had any cardiac events before? I asked the man who was clearly her husband. He shook his head. Is she on any medications? Blood pressure. And something for her heart, I think. I can't remember the name. That's okay. Did anyone call 911? From behind me, I'm calling now. I kept her still. I talked to her, not the way you talk to someone to calm them, but the way you talk to someone to keep them present, to give them something to follow while their body figures out what it's doing. I told her my name. I told her help was coming. I told her to keep her eyes on me. I am not a physician. I want to be clear about that. I'm an engineer. But I was a first responder certified through my company's emergency protocols. I'd done advanced first aid training twice. And I had once 3 years ago managed a colleague's cardiac event in a remote testing facility 60 miles from the nearest hospital. I knew what to do in the gap between something is wrong and the paramedics are here. I filled that gap. The room was very quiet in the way rooms get when something real is happening. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. By that time, the woman's color had improved, her breathing had steadied, and she was speaking in short sentences. I gave the first paramedic a summary of what I'd observed: pulse irregularity, possible medication interaction, timeline of events. And he looked at me with the brief professional nod that means you've said what he needed to hear. I stepped back. My hands were shaking slightly. They do that sometimes, when the adrenaline has somewhere to go. I was looking for somewhere to set my water glass when I heard a voice directly behind me. That was a textbook response. I turned around. Gerald Harmon was standing 2 feet away, watching me with an expression that I can only describe as calibrated attention. The look of someone who has spent a long time assessing things and doing it quickly. Thank you, I said. Are you medical? No, engineering. Something shifted in his expression. Which firm? I told him. He was quiet for a moment. I know your company. Most people in the industry do. What do you work on? I told him that too. Carefully, the way you do when you're at a party and not at a briefing. The version that conveys what matters, without conveying what can't be said in a room full of people. He listened the way he probably listened to everything. Completely, without interruption, without the social signals that most people use to indicate they're following along and that actually mean they're waiting for their turn to speak. When I finished, he said, "You're Claire Ashworth." I hadn't told him my last name. Your team's work on the meridian frame analysis, we reviewed it last spring. It was passed around our engineering board. There was a note attached that said it represented the best structural logic we'd seen on that class of aircraft in 4 years. I had written that analysis. I had stayed up for 2 nights to get the modeling right, and when I submitted it, I had received an email from my supervisor saying good work and nothing else, because that was the culture, and I had decided that was enough. I didn't know it had gone outside the company, I said. Harmon Aerospace has a standing interest in talent that thinks the way that analysis was written. That kind of work doesn't come from following a framework, it comes from understanding why the framework exists. He paused. How long have you been at your current firm? 6 years. Are you happy there? It was such a direct question that I almost laughed. I'm satisfied. That's not the same thing. No, I said. It isn't. He looked at me for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and produced a card, heavy, cream-colored, the kind of card that requires a specific decision to carry rather than just having them printed. He held it out. I'd like you to have a conversation with my head of structural systems. Not a formal interview, a conversation. If what she thinks matches what I'm thinking, we can talk about what that might look like. I took the card. My hands had stopped shaking. I should tell you, I said, because I believe in people having information, that I'm in the middle of a classified project cycle. I can't move quickly. I'm not asking you to move quickly. I'm asking you to have a conversation. He paused. The woman you just helped, her name is Patricia. She's been my head of legal affairs for 12 years. I will be thinking about what you did tonight for a long time. He excused himself to go check on Patricia, and I stood there near the bookshelves holding a cream-colored card. I became aware, gradually, that I was not alone in the way I had been alone a few minutes ago. There were people near me who had been near me for a while. One of them was my father. He was standing about 8 feet away, and he had the look of a man who has just watched something happen that he didn't have a category for. Not shock exactly. Something more complicated than shock. The look of a person doing arithmetic that isn't coming out the way they expected. Diane was next to him. Her expression was different from his. I had seen Diane's expressions my entire life, and what I saw in her face in that moment was something I had not seen before. It wasn't quite embarrassment and it wasn't quite reassessment. It was the specific look of a person realizing that they had been holding a map of a city and had just discovered the city is larger than the map. My father said my name, just my name, nothing else. I looked at him. I thought about the wine I'd put in the kitchen. The appetizer tray. The sparkling water. The 31 years of being the daughter who lived in her head and didn't amount to anything you could point to. I thought, you don't need to hear me say it. You already know. I'm glad Patricia is okay, I said. I'm going to go say goodbye to her before I leave. I walked across the room. I said goodbye to Patricia, who was sitting up now and holding her husband's hand and had more color in her face than she'd had an hour ago. She thanked me 3 times and I told her once was enough. I gave her the name of a cardiologist in Phoenix I'd looked up on my phone, the one with the best reviews for the kind of event she'd experienced. Then I got my coat. I said thank you to the caterers because no one else would. I walked to the door. My father caught up with me in the entrance hall. He put his hand on my arm. Not grabbing, just placing, the way you do when you want someone to stop, but you're not sure you have the standing to require it. Claire. I stopped. He looked at me, and I could see him searching for something, for the sentence that would be the right sentence, the one that covered what needed to be covered without costing him more than he wanted to spend. My father is a man who spent 40 years making deals, and the instinct never fully leaves. You were what you did in there. With the woman. Patricia. With Patricia. That was. He stopped. I didn't know you could do that. There are a lot of things you don't know about me, I said. Not cruelly. Just as a fact, offered without decoration. He absorbed this. Gerald Harmon is one of the most important people in American aviation. I know who he is. He knows your work. Yes. My father looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked back at me, and there was something in his expression that I want to be careful about describing, because I don't believe in overstating moments just because they feel significant. It wasn't a transformation. It wasn't a reckoning. It was smaller than that. It was a man in his 60s, on his birthday, at a party he'd been proud of, standing in his entrance hall and understanding for the first time that his daughter had built something substantial in his absence, and that the absence had been chosen, and that the choosing had been mostly his. "I should have asked more," he said. The 3 most honest words he'd said to me in 10 years. "Yes," I said, "you should have." I kissed him on the cheek. He stood there holding the wall with one hand like the building had shifted underneath him. I took a car to my hotel. I sat in the back seat and watched the Phoenix lights go by and felt the particular exhaustion that comes not from doing too much, but from carrying something heavy for a long time and setting it down. I looked at the card in my hand. Cream-colored, heavy, Gerald Harmon's name printed in ink that didn't try too hard. I thought about the meridian frame analysis. I thought about the 47 pages of calculations that had taken me 2 nights and that had apparently spent the last year being passed around a boardroom I'd never seen. I thought about the way Gerald Harmon had listened, completely, without performing interest, just actually having it. I thought about my father saying something you could point to. "Here is what I know about worth. It doesn't require a witness. It accumulates whether or not anyone is watching. The work is the work, whether the right person is in the room or not." I had not done any of what I had done tonight in order to be seen. I had helped Patricia because Patricia needed help. I had answered Gerald Harmon's questions because they were honest questions asked in good faith. The card in my hand was not a vindication of anything. It was just a consequence. Consequences follow the work eventually, with or without an audience. But I will say this, there is something that happens when the work is finally visible to the people who have been looking past it. It doesn't change the work. It doesn't change what you know about yourself. It just closes a loop that you had quietly, privately kept open for longer than you meant to. The loop closed somewhere on the 101, heading toward Scottsdale. I put the card in my jacket pocket and looked out the window. I wasn't angry. I wasn't triumphant. I was just a woman in the back of a car, heading toward a good night's sleep, with a conversation to schedule on Monday morning. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was, finally, something you could point to. I used to think that being unseen was the worst thing that could happen to a person. I spent years believing that if the people closest to me didn't recognize what I was building, then maybe the building didn't count. That's a quiet kind of damage, the kind that doesn't announce itself. It just sits in the back of every room you walk into, whispering that you have to earn your place even in spaces that were supposed to be yours by default. What I understand now is that the work was always the answer, not as a performance, not as proof offered to someone who had already decided not to look, but as the simple, compounding result of showing up and doing the thing with full attention, day after day, whether or not anyone was keeping score. Claire didn't walk into that party planning to change anything. She walked in carrying wine and a red eye's worth of exhaustion and the quiet determination of a woman who has learned that her presence has to be enough, even when it isn't acknowledged. When she knelt on that floor and kept Patricia present and calm, she wasn't thinking about her father standing somewhere behind her. She was thinking about the woman in front of her. That's what integrity actually looks like. It isn't the dramatic declaration or the moment of confrontation. It's the choice you make when the stakes are real and no one has asked you to step up, and you do it anyway because it's the right thing and you know how. The cause was 6 years of honest work, applied carefully, without an audience. The effect was a cream-colored card in the jacket pocket and a father standing in an entrance hall doing arithmetic that didn't add up the way he'd always assumed it would. That's not luck. That's not timing. That's what happens when a person invests in themselves so completely and for so long that the investment eventually becomes visible whether they intend it to or not. There is a kind of intelligence that isn't measured in test scores or credentials. It's the intelligence of understanding why something matters, not just how to do it. Claire had that. She built it by asking better questions, by staying in rooms that were difficult, by refusing to shrink the work to fit other people's understanding of what she was capable of. And there's a kind of strength that isn't loudness or defiance. It's the strength of continuing to move forward in the absence of encouragement, of building something real without needing someone else to call it real first. What I want you to take from this, from Claire's story, from that room, from the look on her father's face in that entrance hall, is this: the people who underestimate you are not the authority on what you're worth. They never were. Your worth is not determined in the moment someone finally notices it. It was already there. It was there every day you chose the harder, truer path when the easier one was available. It was there in the work. It was accumulating whether the room was watching or not. The world eventually catches up to the work. Not always on the timeline we want, not always in the room we expected, but it catches up. It always catches up.